What would truly make you whole? The question at first seems too grand and abstract to be of any relevance to a person who just wants to live his normal life, but you really only need to play a video game. When the end credits come after hours of fun, it's easy to feel empty and more or less let down. No matter how much you enjoyed it, you either now have to start a new game or go do something else, and the feeling of accomplishment only lasts a short while. The same happens with many other life goals and bigger projects. Many have noted that the point of it all should be the journey, not the destination, but it still doesn't take the sting off the end if you are honest about it. When you add the fact that no matter how you look at it, human beings find themselves in a world that has no clear inherent meaning in it, you stumble on existential dread rather quickly. As you get older and the novelty of the world starts to fade, and you set into a routine of constant repetition, you face the basic question, is this all there is to it? Different religions and metaphysical systems have tried to give answers to these dilemmas across the centuries. Certain themes, such as a lost golden age, reaching enlightenment of some sorts, and a goal of utopia, seem constant in the mythologies of humanity. It's no wonder that the ancients believed in these kinds of things, but I will argue that humanity is psychologically destined to crave the ultimate turning point that will finally make everything alright. There is a hole that needs to be filled, and it is in the core of our character, whether the attempted answer is religious or secular. We will go through a few relatively recent philosophies, both religious and non-religious, and then talk about a sense of mission that nations and civilizations will develop for themselves. Let's start with the religious ones first. Immanuel Kant realized that human beings can't really look at reality in itself. Through reason, we only see a reflection of what our own worldview can provide. But Kant really couldn't explain where this reason comes from. Friedrich Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831, answered this problem with this idea of Geist. Geist can be translated as spirit or mind, but these words really don't contain what Hegel had in mind. Geist is at the same time the collective container of humanity's knowledge and culture, in a way hanging over our heads, so to speak, but it also is God himself. If every person would be a computer and they would be connected to the internet, in this way all of us would be connected to the Geist. For Hegel, God is the only thing that can exist in and for itself. In the sensible world, the world that each one of us experiences, everything exists only through our connection to each other. For example, for someone to be a parent, he or she will need to have a child. Being a parent exists only through these two people in between them. God is the only thing that doesn't require this at all. As completely self-sufficient, God is referred to as the Absolute. However, this is not the complete picture. If you think about yourself as a person, your realization of your identity will only become apparent through your interaction with others. When you meet another person, you will realize that, oh, I'm really similar to this person, or I'm not like this guy at all. And through these distinctions, you as a person will form. If you would have lived all your life in a desert island with no other people at all, you as yourself would not develop as it should. God himself faced a similar situation when he existed by himself before he had created anything. For him to truly be, he would need something to reflect himself off of. The first attempt to remedy this situation was the creation of Lucifer, the light bearer, but he was not up to the task. Lucifer only cared about himself, focusing only on his own being, and without having anything to reflect off from, he fell. So the next, more successful attempt was the creation of the world. The world really isn't anything like God. As God is infinite, the world is finite, determined and limited. God is spirit, but nature knows nothing of spirit. It is created by God, but it cannot enter into a relationship with God. It is just matter, and the animals that inhabit it have no reason. They only function on instinct, so they have no spirit. The world was too far from what God was, too much of an other, and so there was a need for God to reconcile with his creation. In order to bring into freedom and truth what is alien to him, he created humanity. Humanity has spirit, the ability to reason. There is a much stronger spark in us than there is in anything else, and through us the reconciliation process can begin. Hegel didn't see the stories in the Bible literally. They weren't straightforward accounts of what had once happened, but allegorical tales that illustrated philosophical issues. When Adam and Eve were cast out of the paradise for eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, what really happened was humanity's consciousness waking up. Animals can't know good or evil since they function on instinct, but as human beings were now able to think, they would choose between good and evil. Animals get what they need from the nature completely, so in a sense they live in a paradise, but humans cannot be fulfilled like that, so they need to work and toil. In the same way, he saw the story of Jesus. Jesus was the final example, the illustration of God's link to humanity, where man himself could be God himself too. As we die, and how Jesus dies on the cross, death strips away everything that is not purely divine. We differentiate what things are by definition of what they are not. This house is blue because it is not red, green, etc. And so death, the ultimate negative, the thing that makes finite things finite, also makes them divine, infinite. Because God is everything, and the negation of a thing defines the thing itself, God is also death or even dead. For Hegel, the whole point is movement, a circle that will become full, and when it is full, all will finally be well. As we all are connected to the Geist, this collective container of human knowledge and culture that hangs over our heads, and as we all contribute to it, there will come a time when process will be complete, as the story of Jesus illustrated. The Geist through us will grow and grow until it encompasses the whole of the universe. The reconciliation will be complete and God will be at peace. With this explanation, Hegel provides for humanity a goal and a task that we are all part of. The second religious example is Vladimir Soloviev, a Russian mystic and a philosopher who lived from 1853 to 1900. As a young man, Soloviev saw visions of a goddess, Sophia, and he traveled to Middle East to uncover her secrets. Soloviev's work combined Gnosticism, Kabbalah, Hegelianism, and pseudoscience. He lived at a time when modern science was rearing its head and new inventions like trains and electricity were changing the world. He saw the previous philosopher's framework of the most important work happening only in the world of ideas as mistaken. Philosophy should create very real goals for very real problems, and being stuck on two arcane subjects was not useful at all. Quote, "The highest thing one can demand from science, its highest task," he writes, "is to explain to us what is, to show us what should be, and to teach us what we should do. Science, from this perspective, becomes the means not for the objective, dispassionate investigation of law-governed phenomena, but a way of knowing whose purpose is to counteract the evil and meaninglessness of the phenomenal world. Its service to meaning should be an active service. In the face of a lifeless nature and suffering humanity, the whole of science turns into a single universal medicine." Here he defines the goal of the historical process as the realization or complete incarnation of the divine principle, the joint spiritualization of matter and the materialization of the spirit, or the inner harmony and balance of both principles. In this process, the task of humanity is understood as the realization of his divine idea, all unity, or the absolute fullness of being, through the freedom of reason in material nature, which corresponds to the first part of the posited goal of history, namely the spiritualization of matter. The human being is thus the mediator between the absolute realm of the spirit and world of material form, showing or revealing the former in the latter through the medium of reason. You can see how close he was to Hegel in this sense. For Soloviev, matter did not represent the mutability of lifeless agency, but the final manifestation of the absolute, through which and in which the divine could be perceived and known. The question was how all this was supposed to be accomplished. The power of the absolute was lying just there in the matter, you only had to bridge the gap somehow. Science told him that since everything material consists of atoms, there also must be another unit for the energy of the soul, which he started to call monads. Space, or extension, he writes, is merely the result of the interaction of atoms, an expression of the equilibrium, the limit of their inner being in themselves, and thus a definite form of their external being, that is, their being for another. It follows that atoms cannot be defined as the last components of matter, since matter is merely their product. They can only be described as material in their interaction with each other. In a purely material sense, therefore, an atom is a mathematical point or a spatial zero. For him, this means that only monads, the units of soul energy, are the only things that are actually real, and the reality we experience in a matter is just an illusion. Monads cannot be accessed through science, only through speculation. If you find yourself critical of Soloviev's thought processes, you would not be alone. In order to have his model of the world work, he needs to jump through several intellectual hoops. Soloviev goes on to speculate about the potentiality of being. As the will of God creates being, this matter, the illusion that is the byproduct of creation, starts to mimic the properties of the will of God. However, since it cannot do what God can, and it cannot have a being in itself, the matter becomes mad. It will only strive for destruction and violence, to devour others to fill its void. Matter is Satan, the egoist drive that pulls man away from his quest for the divine. Soloviev even adds a fighter for humanity's side, the demiurge, another divine force that fights against Satan. How we see matter in reality, as in desire, attraction, weight, and inertia, are Satan materialized, and the powers of light, sound, and sensation are the doings of the demiurge. Satan would concentrate all of being into matter, but the demiurge keeps things separate by creating space. The task of the spiritualization of matter is necessarily the transition of all that is natural into the realm of immortality. We die because our spiritual power, interiorly bound by sins and passions, proves insufficient to claim, incorporate, and transform into itself our entire external corporeal being. It falls away, and our natural immortality is only half realized. Only our inner dimension is eternal, only the fleshless spirit. Christ, however, was risen as with his body too. In Soloviev's thought, death is not the default condition of human nature, but a sort of intruder. The natural immortality of humanity is not in need of explanation, for it is bound up with the fact of being human. The enigma for the mind is rather the very fact that we die, that our eternal spirits are overtaken by what Soloviev considered the base laws of physical existence. Humanity is not, in his view, made immortal, nor does it make itself immortal, but rediscovers its immortality as rooted in the image of the eternal God. Humanity should thus be united in a common task to defeat death itself, the ultimate enemy. As Soloviev became older, he tended to focus more on the geopolitical issues Russia was facing at the time, since his high hopes for humanity seemed unattainable at the moment. His vision for a man to reach the goal of all unity, the moment where everything finally would be fulfilled, lives strongly in Russian scientific circles today. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, from 1881 to 1955, was a French Jesuit priest and a scientist, studying geology and evolutionary development of man. Serving as a stretcher-bearer in World War I, he had an epiphany about a collective consciousness that enveloped the Earth. Since geosphere means the planet itself and biosphere refers to the life on it, he named his new concept a noosphere, a sphere of human thought. In his book The Phenomenon of Man, Desjardins traces through the evolutionary development of life, how the goal of life itself seems to be the creation of a higher consciousness, as the capacity for thought grows steadily and then exponentially through natural history. Quote, "We are faced with a harmonized collectivity of consciousnesses equivalent to a sort of a super-consciousness. The idea is that of Earth not only becoming covered by myriads of grams of thought, but becoming enclosed in a single thinking envelope, so as to form, functionally, no more than a single vast grain of thought on the sidereal scale, the plurality of individual reflections grouping themselves together and reinforcing one another in the act of a single unanimous reflection. This is the general form in which, by analogy and in symmetry with the past, we are led scientifically to envisage the future of mankind. For Desjardins, a great future awaited us, but he lived through the horrors of both world wars, so he was forced to ask himself why things had instead went to a completely negative direction. If you look at humanity through the time scale of evolution, Desjardins says, we should not be surprised that humanity is at odds with itself still, since we should be using a scope of hundreds of thousands of years. But in all honesty, things right now didn't look that good. Quote, leaving aside individual cases where sexual forces or some extraordinary and transitory common passion come into play, men are hostile or at least close to one another. Like a powder whose particles, however compressed, refuse to enter into molecular contact, deep down men exclude and repel one another with all their might, unless, and this is worse still, their mass forms in such a way that, instead of the expected mind, a new wave of determinism surges up, that is to say, of materiality. As with every other form of life, man, to become fully man, had to become legion. And before becoming organized, a legion is necessarily prey to the play, however directed it be of chance and probability. There are imponderable currents which, from fashion and rates of exchange to political and social revolutions, makes us all the slaves of obscure seethings of the human mass. However spiritualized we suppose its elements to be, every aggregate of consciousness, so long as it's not harmonized, envelops itself automatically at its own level with a vial of new matter or superimposed upon all other forms of matter. Matter, the tangential aspect of every living mass in course of unification. It isn't equipped nor made such efforts to reduce its multitudes to order. We have mass movements, no longer the hordes streaming down from the forests of the north or the steppes of Asia, but the 1 million scientifically assembled. The million in rank and file on the parade ground, the million standardized in the factory, the million motorized. And all this only ending up with communism and National Socialism and the most ghastly feathers. So we get the crystal instead of the cell, the anthill instead of brotherhood. Instead of the upsurge of consciousness which we expected, it is mechanization that seems to emerge inevitably from totalization. The scientific worldview had also led to the undervaluing of personalization, giving the main stage instead to the collective and universal, since science revealed the mechanics of everything and how the only underlying constant was energy that was just constantly changing its shape. However, since Desjardins was waiting for the coming of a supreme consciousness, his view was that this could only manifest itself through the self. Quote, it is only in the direction of hyper-reflection, that is to say, hyper-personalization, that thought can extrapolate itself. Otherwise, how could it garner our conquests, which are all made in the field of what is reflected? At first sight, we are disconcerted by the association of an ego with what is the all. The utter disproportion of the two terms seems flagrant, almost laughable. That is because we have not sufficiently meditated upon the threefold property possessed by every consciousness. 1. Of centering everything partially upon itself. 2. Of being able to center itself upon itself constantly. And 3. Of being brought more by this very supercentration into association with all the other centers surrounding it. Are we not at every instant living the experience of a universe whose immensity, by the play of our senses and our reason, is gathered up more and more simply in each one of us? And in the establishment now proceeding through science and the philosophies of a collective human Weltanschauung, in which every one of us cooperates and participates, are we not experiencing the first symptoms of an aggregation of a still higher order, the birth of some single center from which the convergent beams of millions of elementary centers dispersed over the surface of the thinking earth. All our difficulties and repulsions as regards the opposition between the all and the person would be dissipated if we only understood that, by structure, the noosphere, and more generally the world, represent a whole that is not only closed but also centered. Because it contains and engenders consciousness, space-time is necessarily of a convergent nature. Accordingly, its enormous layers, followed in the right direction, must somewhere ahead become involuted to a point which we might call omega, which fuses and consumes them integrally in itself. However immense the sphere of the world may be, it only exists and is finally perceptible in the directions in which its radii meet, even if this were beyond time and space altogether. Better still, the more immense the sphere, the richer and deeper, and hence the more conscious is the point at which the volume of being that it embraces is concentrated. Because the mind, seen from our side, is essentially the power of synthesis and organization. Seen from this point of view, the universe, without losing any of its immensity, and thus without suffering any anthropomorphism, becomes to take shape. Since to think it, undergo it, and make it act, it is beyond our souls that we must look, not the other way around. In the perspective of no genesis, time and space become truly humanized, or rather superhumanized. Far from being mutually exclusive, the universal and personal, that is to say, the centered, grow in the same direction and culminate simultaneously in each other. It is therefore a mistake to look for the extension of our being or of the noosphere in the impersonal. The future universal could not be anything else but the hyperpersonal at the omega point. End quote. This omega would be the horde of consciousness liberated little by little on earth by no genesis adds itself together and concentrates. Man's greatest work would be to establish in and by each one of us an absolutely original center in which the universe reflects itself in a unique and immutable way. Those centers are our very selves and personalities. However, we would not melt into this one great center. By its structure, omega and its ultimate principle can only be a distinct center radiating at the core of a system of centers. A grouping in which personalization of the all and the personalization of the elements reach their maximum, simultaneously and without merging, under the influence of a supremely autonomous focus of union. Desjardins continues with a criticism of egoism, seen in fascism and communism. For him, egoism confuses individualism with personality. Quote, "In trying to separate itself as much as possible from others, the element individualizes, but in doing so it becomes retrograde and seeks to drag the world backwards towards plurality and into matter. In fact, it diminishes itself and loses itself. To be fully ourselves, it is in the opposite direction, in the direction of convergence with all to the rest, that we must advance, towards the other. The peak of ourselves, the acme of our originality, is not our individuality, but our person. And according to the evolutionary structure of the world, we can only find our person by uniting together. There is no mind without synthesis. Some laws hold good from top to bottom. The true ego grows in inverse proportion to egoism. Like the omega which attracts it, the element only becomes personal when it universalizes itself." End quote. The end of the world will be the ultimate fulfillment of the noosphere. The wholesale internal introversion upon itself of the noosphere, which has simultaneously reached the uttermost limit of its complexity and its centrality. The overthrow of equilibrium, detaching the mind, fulfilled at last, from its material matrix, so that it will henceforth rest all its weight on God Omega. Still, at the very end, Desjardins also worries about an apocalypse, since man can deny the Omega. Quote, "The death of the materially exhausted planet, the split of the noosphere divided on the form to be given to its unity, and simultaneously endowing the event with all its significance and with all its value, the liberation of that percentage of the universe which, across time, space, and evil, will have succeeded in laboriously synthesizing itself to the very end. Not an indefinite progress, which in an hypothesis contradicted by the convergent nature of no genesis, but an ecstasy transcending the dimensions of the framework of the visible universe. Ecstasy in concord or discord, but in either case by excess of interior tension, the only biological outcome proper or conceivable for the phenomenon of man. You can easily see how tightly Desjardins' vision was connected to the tenets of the Catholic faith. These three examples have all been religious, but next I will present metaphysical systems that are not formed around God, yet still carry similar types of themes. Philosopher Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, starts with the question of what it means to be. If there is a sentence, "the house is red," we all know what a house is, we all know what red is, but what is by itself? What does it mean to be to be? Heidegger perceives being in the same way as we could say that Jim runs, but instead we say Jim is, so being holds the same type of active activity as running. The question seems arcane and divorced from reality, but it starts to make sense as the thought process progresses. If there would be a tool shed, what would you need for that tool shed to exist? It should be a shed, and there also should be some tools in it. One tool is not enough, two isn't enough either, but at some point there will be enough for you to call the space as a tool shed. This means that the being of a tool shed is tied to its environment. This is one property for being itself. The second aspect is tied to temporality, meaning the relation to time. With music, at any given moment, you are only hearing the note of the song that is playing right this instant, but for the song to have any meaning, you have to remember all the notes that came before it. Besides this, you also have to anticipate the notes that are coming in the very near future. So for a song to be, time is of the essence. So for the other property of being is time. Heidegger connected these two aspects to the being of a human being. For you to be you, you are tied to your country, its history and culture, since they form who you are, and you couldn't exist without them. Heidegger was an ardent Nazi, and with National Socialism the basic tenets were Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Your meaning came from your connection to the state, and it crystallized through the supreme leader. For Heidegger, Germany has lost its way, and because of that it had lost the First World War. The time was to restore the correct order of being, like tuning up an instrument back to its proper attunement. In a way, Heidegger's vision was sort of like Taoism, where you are seeking the way. This also is an antithesis to the Anglo-American metaphysical view. In many American movies and series, you often find a character who says something about how he has always done what others have wanted of him, and now it's time for him to do what he himself truly wants and find his true self. This preposition, a true self, is a cultural construct just as much as Heidegger's vision is, and we can see people's meaning and value as individuals, or what that brings to the greater society. Either the collective or individual sense of self are real in the same way as this laptop is what I'm using right now, but societies need these frameworks to function. For example, Russia today is more of a collective society, where the state is seen as the focal point of meaning, and it was the same in the Soviet times. But this focal point, this point of being, carries the same weight as the idea of a soul would carry in religious thought. Friedrich Nietzsche, from 1844 to 1900, continued the thought that Kant started when he observed that we can't look the world in itself, since we need our own framework to behold anything in it. For Nietzsche, this framework was his idea of the will to power. The biggest factor of us observing the world is our own will. What can we get out of what we see? How can we bend it to our whim? When an individual becomes successful by gaining money and influence, conquering new territory, or overcoming obstacles, this gives him the greatest joy and meaning. Napoleon saw Europe and he became an emperor for the whole continent, and his ambition would have carried him further still. The negatives of life, like hunger and lack, are there just to replenish this appetite. The vocal point of life is this very moment of striving. Sigmund Freud once said that for a man of action, the world is there for him to test his strength against it. This captures Nietzsche's idea. Besides will to power, Nietzsche advocated the idea of an Übermensch, the overman. By striving, man could finally overcome himself and become something better and greater, as he left behind the shackles of religion. Will to power would be the bridge that would lead us to the overman, the very moment when humanity would be transcended. What this precisely meant is still debated, since the idea remained hazy and unformed for Nietzsche. Julius Evola, 1898 to 1974, was an Italian fascist philosopher. He had similar themes as Nietzsche, but even more warlike. In his Metaphysics of War, he starts with this, quote, "The fundamental principle underlying all justifications of war, from the point of view of human personality, is heroism. War, it is said, offers man the opportunity to awaken the hero who sleeps within him. War breaks the routine of comfortable life. By means of its severe ordeals, it offers and transfiguring knowledge of life, life according to death. The moment the individual succeeds in living as a hero, even if it is the final moment of his earthly life, weighs infinitely more on the scale of values than a protracted existence spent consuming monotonously among the trivialities of cities. From a spiritual point of view, these possibilities make up for the negative and destructive tendencies of war, which are one-sidedly and tendentiously highlighted by pacifist materialism. War makes one realize the relativity of human life and therefore also a law of more than life, and thus war always has an anti-materialist value, a spiritual value." End quote. Fascism was a continuation of the old world, the warrior culture of aristocracy. In movies and other fiction, everyone has seen duels, how a simple insult could lead to a ritualistic life or death fight. In European history, it was the noble's job to fight, and his whole status in society was hinging on this, so at any given moment, he should be able to demonstrate his tendency for facing death. This moment, the vocal point of battle, carried the deepest meaning. Evola and other fascists weren't the only ones with this mindset, as this view was very prevalent at the time. American President Theodore Roosevelt had a speech in the Naval War College in 1897, quote, "No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. All the great masterful races have been fighting races, and the minute that a race loses the hard fighting virtues, then it has lost its proud right to stand as the equal to the rest." End quote. For him, war was a fine and a healthy thing. War would save men from materialism. In war, the greatest virtues would be demonstrated, such as bravery and self-sacrifice, standing together with your comrades against an enemy. Peace and materialism, in the other hand, would sap the vitality of a nation and bring men to sloth and weakness. For Evola, returning to warrior culture would also be the return to the correct state of being, quote, "Since we are not talking about just any old hierarchy, but about true hierarchy, which means that what is above and rules is really what is superior, it is necessary to refer to the systems of civilization in which, at the center, there is a spiritual elite, and the ways of life of the slaves, the bourgeois, and the warriors derive their ultimate meaning and supreme justification from reference to the principle which is specific heritage of this spiritual elite, and manifest this principle in their material activity. However, an abnormal state is arrived at if the center shifts, so that the fundamental point of reference, instead of being the spiritual principle, is that of the servile caste, the bourgeois or the warriors. Each of these castes manifests its own hierarchy and a certain code of cooperation, but each is more unnatural, more distorted, and more subversive than the last, until a process reaches its limit. That is, a system in which the vision of life characteristic of the slaves comes to orientate everything and to imbue itself with all the surviving elements of social wholeness." Like Heidegger, he strived to the original setting of society, and like Nietzsche, he strove for the heroism of a conqueror. So these are the types of things that philosophy has offered us for the last 200 years, religious or not. It is another matter what people have actually done, whatever the ideologies have said, but here too we find the need for a holy mission. I'll give 3 short examples before wrapping up. Back in the 1890s, the Americans felt that the nation hadn't delivered its great promise. The most affluent 1% of the nation's population controlled a fortune greater than the combined resources of the remaining 99%, and the working poor were virtually in serfdom. The economy was stagnating, and it was time to face the fact that Manifest Destiny, the conquering of North American territory, was over. The new world was starting to resemble the old world too much, and there was a collective existential crisis going through all the levels of society. At this point, the elites and intellectuals decided that the American exceptionalism must continue. The new way would be to spread liberal democracy across the globe, releasing downtrodden nations from their shackles and helping them to stand on their own 2 feet via common democratic ideals. This led to US sovereignty for Philippines after the American-Spanish War of 1898. However, the idealistic helping turned over to imperialistic control, and the local populace would be guided towards a common task, making them not so focused on the internal problems of the nation. This same trend has continued since then to the modern day. With British Empire, you can find a similar story. Slavery was abolished in 1833, and Africa was still a dark continent that the Westerners hadn't been able to penetrate. The continent was rife with slavery, as the stronger tribes and kingdoms lorded over the weaker ones, and slaves were sold to Middle East and to the Americas. The first British explorers that got deeper into Africa were appalled with what they saw, and there was a deep conviction to help the locals. A genuine belief in a moral mission led to the scramble for Africa in the 1870s, as the continent was brought under Western imperialism. The same happened yet again with the Japanese Empire. As one of the few nations that didn't fall under Western imperialism, and as the only nation that had managed to modernize itself and face the West on the same level, there was a call for Japan to be the savior of Asia. Termed as the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan would be the leader of the free nations that would be rescued from the clutches of the Western empires. All this fervor, however, led to just a different colonial master for these Asian nations. There were well-meaning people in all these instances who wanted to do good, and a sense of promised land was just out there. By working together, it could be achieved. We really can't seem to shed away the promise of a shining utopian tomorrow, or a vocal point where humanity would transcend itself or reach an apex in one way or another. In today's world, AI and technology are now carrying that promise, as we would go to terraform Mars with our spaceships and beyond humanity as we merge the consciousnesses of man and machine. Those promises might either ring hollow or bring the same kind of misery as ideologies and religions have at their worst delivered. In the meantime, we can just wait, seeking for meaning just like the first man did.